Merci, excusez-nous donc du retard, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs. Bonjour tout le monde. Nous avons l'honneur donc de vous accueillir aujourd'hui à la 51e session de la Commission économique pour l'Afrique et de la conférence des ministres africains des finances, de la planification et du développement économique qui s'ouvre ce jour. Donc, avant de vous livrer mes propres observations préliminaires, je me tiens à remercier au nom de l'ensemble du bureau sortant que je préside, le gouvernement et la population de la République fédérale d'Éthiopie pour l'accueil chaleureux et l'hospitalité qui nous ont été réservés dans cette belle ville d'Addis Ababa. Je voudrais également exprimer notre sincère gratitude à la secrétaire exécutive, j'y reviendrai.
Economic Communication for Africa for the excellent organization of this conference. Executive Secretary of the ECA, representative of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Ambassador of Ethiopia, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of international and intergovernmental organizations, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of NGOs here present and of the civil society, distinguished experts of the member states, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me, first of all, to very warmly congratulate Madame Zora Sangi, Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, on the occasion of the 50 years, and also congratulations on the very rich accomplishments of the ECA towards working towards the economic integration of Africa in cooperation with the ADB. The ACA has contributed largely to the progress in Africa, the implementation of Agenda 2063, and in particular the African Continental Free Trade Area, the fight against illicit financial flows, and the quest for funding, among other accomplishments. We know we can continue to count on your contribution to face the challenges for the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. We therefore thank the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. It is a great pleasure that I chair the opening ceremony on behalf of West Africa in its entirety of this meeting, preparatory meeting of experts for the 51st meeting of the Conference of Ministers of African Ministers of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. This meeting is a fitting forum for discussing on how to face the various challenges that our continent is faced with, and in particular, the realization of the African Continental Free Trade Area, creating fiscal space for jobs and economic diversification, a theme of utmost importance. It's therefore occasion for us to analyze the opportunities for economic development and job creation for the youth of this continent, who are increasing in great numbers thanks to general demographic growth. Our deliberations should make it possible to identify the accompanying measures for the enlarging of the space, the fiscal case for jobs and economic diversification, to stimulate industrialization for inclusive growth, job creation for the youth and women. Quite obviously, the experts will also delve into the strategies for African Continental Free Trade Area for actions to change the structure of exports of African countries in composition, but also in their geographical orientation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm all the more happy to be with you this morning on behalf of the entire West Africa and on behalf of Senegal. Since we find ourselves here in a continent launched resolutely towards the implementation of AfCFTA, His Excellency the President of Senegal, Macky Sall, with the other heads of state and government, signed in March this year an agreement setting up the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is important for the economic development of Africa, for development of trade, and the fight against fragmentation of the continent through rationalization of integration efforts with the ultimate objective of arriving at the setting up of the African Economic Community, which you hope to see realized according to the Abuja Declaration. However, as you all know, the challenges are many. The 54 countries of Africa with 1 billion consumers, but the trade remain very low at 15% against 60%, for instance, within the European Union. And the majority of the products that are exchanged are primary goods which have not been processed. And most of our activities are in the informal sector. We therefore should be developing the supply chains within Africa. Thanks to the joint action that is envisaged in the action plan for accelerated industrialization for Africa and the development of trade in Africa and the program for the development of infrastructures in Africa. And the African continent cannot remain at the margins at a time when the major economic blocks are being drawn up and major economic agreements are being signed. Ladies and gentlemen, as experts entrusted with finance and economic development, we must work towards structural implementations to face the challenges that result in poverty and joblessness. That's why I would like to urge the continued development of our trade towards the creation of an African and AfCFTA. We should be going towards dispensing with development assistance, even if the needs for resource mobilizations are there. So the African Continental Free Trade Area will facilitate sustainable fund mobilization for continued sustained development of the region. Is all the more necessary to mobilize resources for the AfCFTA, a major challenge for our political leaders. We cannot alone, our leaders cannot alone face these challenges. So all those who are creating jobs should contribute towards defining solutions. The ratification and implementation is also of most importance, and we must pursue consultations and with different actors in different states for impact studies.
معرفة بنود الجمود
les ressources internes afin d'offrir aux décideurs
الساسة من أجل بناء القارة التي نتطلع إليها. إن إنشاء هذه المنطقة الحرة القارية هي إحدى بنود أجندة 2063 التي تهدف إلى التحول الهيكلي. السيدات والسادة، إن اجتماع الخبراء سيقوم بمناقشات أساسية حول التغيرات الاقتصادية
economic and social changes necessary for the kind of progress we are aiming at, and the assessment of the regional integration realizations through the various dimensions that have been renew my thanks to the UN Economic Commission for Africa for their trust and shown to
cette importante rencontre de haut niveau. Ces remerciements s'adressent aussi aux partenaires au développement et aux membres du comité d'experts sur les finances, la planification économique et l'intégration pour les efforts qu'ils ne cessent de déployer et les appuis techniques dont nous avons besoin pour la formulation et la conduite des politiques publiques. J'en suis sûr, les débats qui portent sur les questions fascinantes relatives à la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, ainsi que les marges de manœuvre budgétaires en faveur de l'emploi et la diversification économique, déboucheront certainement sur des recommandations importantes pour l'avenir de l'Afrique, notre chère Afrique. En ma qualité de président sortant, je réitère à nouveau toute notre satisfaction à l'égard du réel engouement des participants au cours de cette rencontre. Je renouvelle à nouveau notre gratitude à l'égard de la CIA pour le choix de la thématique et la planification de l'événement. Je remercie encore les autorités de la République éthiopienne qui, conscientes de l'importance de ces assises pour l'émergence de nos pays, se sont fortement impliqués dans l'organisation et la réussite de cette réunion. Pour terminer, je voudrais souhaiter la bienvenue à l'Afrique du Nord
them that they will have the very heavy task of ensuring the realization of the reforms that are necessary for the putting in place of the AfCFTA. And such efforts will move us towards a concretization of the solutions towards a dynamic and prosperous region. With this, may I wish you success in your deliberations. Many thanks. Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Madame Dara Sange, Executive Secretary of the ECA, for her speech. Thank you very much. Chair of the outgoing bureau, I would also like to take advantage of this opportunity to thank your ambassador, His Excellency Diop, and to congratulate you because it's your National Day of Senegal. Congratulations. We thank you for taking the necessary time to come here. You are a friend that I've known for a long time, and I'm happy to see you. Commissioners of the African Union, brothers and sisters of the African Development Bank with whom we work very closely. I would also like to say good afternoon and thank the High Excellency, the Ambassador of Ethiopia. As you said, we would like to thank the Federal Republic of Ethiopia from the outset for all they've done to ensure the success of this meeting. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen.
The diplomatic capital of Africa for the 51st session of the Conference of African Ministers of Finance, Planning and Economic Development on the theme African Continental Free Trade Area and Fiscal Space for Jobs and Economic Diversification. Let me take this opportunity to welcome amidst us the representative, again, of the government of Ethiopia and the people of Ethiopia for their continued hospitality and support for hosting this conference. If the Minister of Energy was here, he would tell you to also visit Ethiopia before you leave, because Ethiopia is a beautiful country, so I'm going to do it on his behalf. This 2018 Conference of Ministers is opportune, and its theme could not be more timely and appropriate, as Mr. Kamara has said. On the 21st of March 2018, Africa made history by signing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which ushers in a new era of promise and provides a historic opportunity for the continent to unleash its development potential. The agreement was signed at the 10th Extraordinary Summit of the African Union Heads of States and Government by 44 African Union member states. A further 6 African Union member states signed the Kigali Declaration, committing to sign the African Continental Free Trade Area, following the finalization of domestic review processes. The Economic Commission for Africa sees this agreement as an instrument to reposition the African continent as a competitive player in the global arena. However, to realize the promise of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement and achieve its development goals, the continent must take bold actions on many fronts. The most important and urgent action is to create the fiscal space needed to foster both public and private investment while ensuring economic diversification with a view to creating jobs. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, now we must seize the momentum at hand to focus on how to operationalize the agreement in a manner that realizes its potential to the benefit of the average African. Our collective market potential cannot be underestimated. As incomes rise and the middle class continues to grow, household spending is expected to grow at 3.9% per annum to reach $2.1 trillion. Corporate spending is expected to reach $3.5 trillion by 2025 as well. Taking the opportunities created by the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, this is an opportunity for corporate Africa to leverage these expansions and boost economic growth. Through implementation of the African CFTA, we can generate the kind of growth that can support economic diversification, industrialization, and meet Agenda 2063 and Africa we want for all of us. Manufactured products make up 46% of intra-Africa trade and only 22% of Africa's trade with the rest of the world. So boosting intra-African trade through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is likely to support the continent's industrialization. Indeed, according to our estimates, the African CFTA will increase Africa's industrial exports by over 50% by 2022. The agreement can also help to promote the type of business and trade that benefits small and medium enterprises, women and the youth, which account for about 80% of the region's businesses. Nevertheless, the African CFTA also has implications for our fiscal policies in Africa. Some might be concerned that the CFTA would lead to losses of tariff revenues, and this will create holes in national budgets. But in fact, the impact of the agreement on fiscal revenues is likely to be minimal. This is for several reasons. Amongst others, first, intra-African trade is only a small share of Africa's total trade, as we've said before. Most of intra-African trade is barely liberalized under the Regional Economic Community's free trade agreements. Therefore, the CFTA is likely to affect only about 7% of Africa's total imports under current patterns. Second, countries will be allowed to exclude a certain number of tariff lines from liberalization, as intra-African trade tends to be highly if they need to do so. As a result, tariff revenue losses will be limited. Given the small size of these losses, it will be important not to make the exclusions too large, as this may risk undermining the economic benefits of the CFTA. Third, tariff revenues are not the largest source of government revenue for African countries. They account for only 15% of total tax revenue in Africa. Finally, tariff reductions in the CFTA are to be phased in gradually over a period of 5 years for developing countries and 10 years for least developed countries, or 10 to 13 years respectively for sensitive products. Fourth, these tariff revenue losses may be outweighed by the additional revenues from growth to be generated by the CFTA. In particular, as outlined in the issues paper for this conference, the CFTA is expected to increase GDP by between 1 to 6%, which should broaden the tax base, boost revenue collection. What is more, these estimates are likely to substantially underestimate the economic benefits of the CFTA, as they do not take into account the impact of liberalization in services and investment. Initial modeling of the impacts of service services liberalization under the CFTA, for example, suggests that it will produce significant additional economic gains. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, the CFTA should also prompt us to discuss broader reforms which will create more fiscal space on the continent. After all, the CFTA would lead each country to examine exactly what it means for their public revenues, whether any changes are needed, and especially how to make the most of the CFTA. We will need to implement complementary policies, such as those outlined in the Action Plan for Boosting Intra-Africa Trade. But we should carry out a broader review of our macroeconomic policies, focusing on fiscal policy, and whether it will be fit for purpose to help us not only to adapt, but to make the most of the CFTA. Most of the resources needed for these investments for the CFTA will be mobilized within the continent through fiscal policy. While private finance will play a role, there is a limited extent to which private sector can be leveraged to fund public investments required to realize the SDGs and Agenda 2063. So we hope that with the CFTA, the governments will be able to increase their revenues, focus more on public sector investments, education, and health, while we crowd in a private sector that comes to Africa in search of bigger and larger markets. We need to improve our levels of fiscal space, even to take better advantage of the CFTA. Because as part of taking advantage of the CFTA, we're going to need to improve our infrastructure, our energy, our logistics. And for this, we need additional revenues. We are going to need to tackle issues of illicit financial flows. We're going to need to expand the tax base. The CFTA in itself is meant to increase production and diversify our economies. And this process should help us enlarge and expand the tax base as we go about it. As we tackle issues of profit-shifting activities from multinational corporations, which have been estimated to cost Africa at least 2% of GDP in foregone tax revenues, we will also be helping foster the CFTA. So as you see, ladies and gentlemen, the CFTA is all-encompassing. It is an important part of fiscal policy, and that is why we decided as the ECA today to take a look at how the CFTA and trade can fit into the overall discussions. We thought bringing in the ministers of finance, the economic ministers, as Mr. Kamara, the chair, said, will be important, both to understand the macro dimensions and the trade implications of the CFTA, but also the micro dimensions of removing border controls and working towards a faster and more efficient union. All prescriptions of pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical policies are no longer a remedy for the continent to grow. As the rest of the world wonders about the benefits of trade, I think Africa, in signing the CFTA, has resolutely said it believes that trade is a means and a vehicle for development and for inclusive growth. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, even before the CFTA, recent growth trajectories across the continent was already promising. In 2017, Africa recorded a growth rate of 3.1%, up from 1.6%. Growth is forecast to get to about 3.9% in 2018 and stay the same in 2019. These trends are underpinned by sustained improvement in macroeconomic management and good economic governance, as well as increasing trade and investment ties within Africa and with other emerging economies. A big challenge, which is also an opportunity, is that Africa's growth remains low relative to its potential. While some countries attain double-digit growth, such as the ones that we're sitting in today, have been doing for a long time and growing at 8%, many other countries are not doing as well. And we believe that to get to the 8% growth that is experienced in Ethiopia, we will need higher levels of investment. About 21.4% of GDP of investment will be needed to speed up economic diversification and enhance our global competitiveness. The CFTA allows us to do that by ensuring that Africa can begin to trade with itself, because we know that when Africa trades with itself, Africa trades more value-added goods, and the process of technological transfer, learning, and innovation is faster. This is why we believe that the CFTA is a fundamental piece, not only of Africa's integration, but of Africa's economic growth and of job creation for the youth. Aggregate manufacturing output in between 2009 and 2016, in absolute terms, contributes only 18% of value added to the economy today. Although showing some signs of industrialization and structural transformation, this performance calls for urgent action by African countries to diversify their economy. Economic transformation is the only sure way to accelerate job creation in the face of slow progress towards the continent's social development goals, coupled with huge demographic pressures in some regions of Africa. Notwithstanding the improvements of the working class, we still see Africa as a continent that has 49% of its population living below the poverty line. In 2014, 60% of Africa's working population was trapped in vulnerable jobs, while in 2015, 1 in 3 workers in West, East, Central, and Southern Africa lived in extreme poverty. The youth, particularly women, bear the brunt of poverty and unemployment, and most importantly, of vulnerability, and are more likely to migrate or seek alternative means of survival. These trends suggest that the continent's demographic profile could very well pose a serious challenge as opposed to a dividend if we do not take advantage of the benefits of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which would allow us to produce goods that we can sell to each other and which require initially lower levels of investment. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is no secret that accelerating inclusive growth and economic diversification hinges crucially on the ability of the continent to mobilize and effectively use its domestic resources to expand the regional market. Lately, we have witnessed an increase in the cost of external borrowing, and our expectation is that this trend will continue. Therefore, an even more urgent need for increasing our domestic resources. As our economies continue to diversify, as our policies continue to improve, we believe that the CFTA is just one more anchor to improving the overall well-being and prosperity of the Africans. I cannot end this presentation without stopping to congratulate Kenya and Ghana for being the first countries that yesterday ratified the Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think so. He just said next will be Senegal. I think that shows the zeal and the ambition of the continent, because after the signing in Kigali, there was a discussion around how soon and how quickly will countries ratify. And it was a pleasure yesterday to see that it's not only that countries are ratifying, but there is a race to ratification. Countries want to be the first, countries want to be among the top 10. We still have 8 spots going. So we hope that by the time we get to Mauritania, we will have an important number. And by the time we come back to Addis next year in January, the 22 countries that are needed for ratification would have signed and ratified the CFTA, and all the discussions that we will be having over the next 2 or 3 days to ensure that the CFTA helps us produce growth, inclusive growth, prosperity for the continent, and injects Africa as a continent into the global economy as it deserves, will produce fruitful results and fruitful policy guidance for our ministers when they come on Monday. Once again, and in conclusion, let me emphasize that the CFTA promises to be one of the greatest steps forward to comprehensive and holistic integration that the continent has ever seen. We need to make sure that we have the fiscal resources and the space to make the most of it, and the ECA remains a committed and trusted partner in this process. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Excusez-moi de parler anglais. Bon, merci. Je pense que vous pouvez bien compter sur le Sénégal pour la signature et la ratification. Inch'Allah, on va même mettre en œuvre notre diplomatie pour encourager tous les autres États dans la sous-région. En tout cas, merci pour votre belle allocution qui montre que qui nous rassure sur les enjeux.
Reassures us about the challenges that you have listed them very appropriately, and all the diagnosis that you have made, and the reference situation that you were able to draw up, and all the expectations that we have the right to express in terms of this CFTA. Thank you very much for your kind advocacy. And now I would like to invite His Excellency, Her Excellency, Madame Venesh Tadesse, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Federal Republic of Ethiopia to the ECA to deliver her speech.
Merci, Excellence.
Thank you, Your Excellency.
Mr. Kamra Mayasin, the Chair of the Outgoing Bureau, Excellency Dr. Vera Songwe, the Executive Secretary of UNECA, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me, from the outset, welcome you all to Addis Ababa for the 51st session of the Conference of African Ministers of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. This year's theme, African Continental Free Trade Area, creating physical space for jobs and economic diversification, is timely and crucial in moving forward the agreement signed by 54 member states of the African Union on March 21st, 2018 in Kigali, Rwanda, during the extraordinary summit of the African Union. The economic integration agenda of Africa has reached a new height when most of African Union member states signed the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area, one of the flagship projects of Agenda 2063. As the Executive Secretary said, yesterday, Ghana and Kenya led the way by depositing instruments of ratification of the agreement, and I want to take this opportunity to congratulate Ghana and Kenya for blazing the trail. This is clearly demonstrates the commitment of Africans in the attainment of the Pan-African vision of an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, the Africa we want. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, no doubt this is an important milestone on its own right. We should, however, bear in mind that we will still have a lot of work to do to reach the ultimate goal of accelerating inter-Africa trade and using trade as an engine of growth and sustainable development to our continent. The outstanding issue in the first phase of negotiation and the second phase of negotiation will need the same, if not more, commitments of member states than the process that led to the signing of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. In addition, the agreement has to be accompanied by national strategies to build productive capacities and put in place the required trade-related infrastructure in order to ensure its benefit to all African countries. Ethiopia strongly believes that the discussion of the Committee of Experts from the Ministers of Finance and Planning on the African Continental Free Trade Area, such as this, will be critical to have more understanding of the benefits as well as the challenges of establishing a free trade area. In-depth discussion on the issue will help the member states in devising ways to enhance the benefits and adequately prepare to tackle certain challenges which I believe are temporary. I would therefore wish to express our gratitude to UNECA and especially to Excellency Dr. Vera Songwe for choosing this timely theme and providing this important platform. Before I conclude, let me remind all our distinguished guests to make this time to visit Addis Ababa beyond the magnificent UNECA conference facilities. I wish you all a fruitful deliberation and a very pleasant stay in Addis. I thank you.
Merci, Excellence. Merci pour votre brillante allocution. Mesdames et
Speech, ladies and gentlemen. We shall now proceed to item 2 on our agenda regarding the election of the Bureau, the election of the new Bureau. And I would like to point out that according to the proposed rotation, as you're all aware, the outgoing Bureau should be presided by Northern Africa, and the vice chairmanship, or rather the incoming Bureau, will be presided by Northern Africa, and the vice chairmanship, or the first vice chairman, represented by Central Africa. And the text also says that the second chair should be from Eastern Africa and the third from Southern Africa. West Africa as rapporteur, because West Africa is the outgoing bureau. Now, taking into account the fact that Northern Africa is still consulting, perhaps we should wait the outcome of the consultations, which means that we cannot elect the chair immediately. As far as the vice chairman is concerned, it is my pleasure to inform you that we received a proposal from Chad, who said will be willing to be part of the bureau if no other country of that sub-region does not put forward its candidacy. So this is a door which is opening, and we have also held consultations and previous discussions that East Africa has chosen Ethiopia as the second vice chairperson of the incoming bureau. For the third vice chair from Southern Africa, they are still consulting in that region, and the outcome perhaps are going to reach us soon. And for the rapporteur from West Africa, it has been suggested that Senegal be the rapporteur. These are the proposals that we have thus far. If we have no objection, we can then take it that we have part of the bureau that has been appointed, but we're still waiting to hear the outcome of the other consultations as to the other posts of the bureau. So since the incoming bureau has not been completed, the outgoing bureau in the meantime will continue to chair the subsequent items of the agenda. I could open the floor now for discussion if there's anybody who would like to address this issue, especially or shall we give the floor to the Dean? So I would like to give the floor to Madam the Secretary of the Commission to provide us with some additional information regarding a committee that was put in place by the Commission on the 3rd of May. Madam, you have the floor.
The Bureau of the Commission met on 3rd May to review the preparations of the 51st session and decided that to enhance the efficiency of the work of the Conference of Ministers, it has established an ad hoc drafting committee to take responsibility for reviewing and clearing the report of the experts meeting and pre-screened draft resolutions submitted with a view to merging, reconciling or clarifying them as necessary prior to their consideration by the Conference of Ministers in plenary meeting. The Secretariat drafting team will work with the ad hoc committee and will submit at the end of each segment the reports relating to the segment of the committee. The drafting committee will have a membership of 10 to be made up of members of the outgoing and the incoming bureau and will be chaired by the first vice chairperson of the incoming bureau. I would like to request the bureau members to nominate amongst your delegation the officials who will represent them on the committee. Please forward the nominations to the Secretary of the Commission. We will be in touch with the bureau members in order to obtain the nominations for the ad hoc committee. Thank you.
Merci, Madame. la secrétaire. Merci pour les informations.
For this additional information. Perhaps for the following items, if there are for the subsequent items, or for those who are still in consultation, or for what we have just said regarding Central Africa, Eastern Africa, and West Africa, I would like to hear if there are any objections before going on to the next item, which is the presentation of the various subjects and themes on the agenda. The floor is open. Can we take it, therefore, that Northern Africa is still in consulting for the chairmanship of the Bureau, and that the first vice chairperson, Chad, is ready and willing? Are there any countries from that region which are against that proposal? From the Central Africa, because Chad says if there is an interested country, they could also, give way to another candidate. If there are no objections, if there is no alternative candidacy, then I take it we can retain that Chad would be the first chair representing Central Africa. For Eastern Africa, we have Ethiopia. Consultations were held. Ethiopia was nominated rather. I take it that there is no objection for the post of the second chairperson. And then for the post of the third chairperson, we also have Southern Africa, which is still consulting on this. So these two posts are still pending, and since they're consulting, therefore we cannot say that we have a complete list of the Bureau members, and Senegal will be the rapporteur of the Bureau. Before going on to any other item, to at least make sure that I'm on the right path, request you to please applaud in consent. Thank you. I am reassured now with this applause. And now,
Donc, merci. On va donc
thank you. We shall proceed with the agenda. But as you have been able to note, we are going to take a break after the two thematic items, taking into account the delays. And we do apologize vis-à-vis the authorities and the delegations not to have validated the change in the agenda hours. Having said this, I think perhaps we could take up the first two thematic sessions before taking a break. So for the first session, we will be tackling the overview of recent economic and social developments in Africa. That's agenda item 3. And then assessment of progress on regional integration in Africa, agenda item 4. And it is with great pleasure that I am going to continue chairing this meeting of experts. And before giving the floor to the next speaker, and before we listen to the various presentations, I would like to give you some announcements regarding organizations so that you know in which way we're heading, and to make sure that we work on time as much as we can. So for each item, we have almost 90 minutes now for these two presentations, overview of recent economic and social developments in Africa and assessment of progress on regional integration in Africa. These two presentations will be presented. Each one will have 15 minutes, and then we will hold a general discussion for 60 minutes. We have 60 minutes for a general discussion. So the two presentations will be made in half an hour, 15 minutes each, and then we shall have an hour for Q&A and discussion before going on to the following item. Are there any objections? I would like to, without further ado, I would like to recognize Mr. Adam Eliaraka, Director of the Macroeconomic Policy Division of the Economic Commission for Africa, to make this presentation on the overview of recent economic and social developments in Africa. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As we meet today, Africa has made a turnaround in terms of growth. As the Executive Secretary mentioned in her opening statement, Africa grew at 3.1% in 2017, up from about 1.6% the year before, and the prospect is positive. Africa also continues to make progress in terms of social development, in terms of addressing issues of poverty, inequality, education, health, and so on. And overall, fiscal and current account deficits in Africa remain stable, and actually we have seen a slight decline in 2017 in fiscal deficit. And we have seen changes in monetary policy to respond to challenges of pressure on currencies and changes in trade. Africa's trade performance rebounded during 2017, which is a good sign, another good sign, and the outlook for Africa as a whole is positive. So this figure one shows a growth rebound in 2017 in Africa, and Africa is once again the second highest growing region in the world, second to East and South Asia. The continent as a whole, and we have observed this over so many years, which is a good sign, and we would like to encourage all countries to maintain this good macroeconomic governance, good macroeconomic management that helped the continent to really maintain a sort of stability that was conducive to investment and growth in most countries. Although we have risk in some countries, and we also have seen slow diversification in sectors, different sectors, although the diversification we have seen so far remains limited compared to Africa's potential and Africa's need to create jobs and to accelerate and sustain growth over the medium and long term. Looking at growth by sub-region, East Africa continues to be the best performing sub-region, maintaining growth of about 5.3% in 2017, and East Africa was the region that invested a lot in infrastructure. We have seen most countries in the region maintaining the high trend, the trend of high investment in infrastructure and in social services. But East Africa seems to be doing more relative to GDP. We have also seen the agricultural sector rebounding in many countries in 2017, contributing to growth. And most countries in the region actually stabilized in 2017 compared to 2016 and 2015 as well. So we have seen a narrowing of fiscal deficit for Africa as a whole to 5% of GDP in 5.3% in 2017 compared to a high of about 9.6% the year before, and a much higher deficit in 2015. This was due to fiscal consolidation in a number of countries, and this is also a demonstration of continued commitment to sound macroeconomic management in most countries. However, we have seen some pressure on debt, public debt. We have seen especially increases in external debt. And also the quality of debt has changed a lot in terms of interest rates. So many countries committed to foreign loans at high interest rates, and this can be a challenge in the medium and long term in terms of repayment requirements. Overall, also we have seen improvement in terms of inflation rates. For the continent as a whole, the rate of inflation declined in 2017 to about 13%, and it's expected to, it's expected to really decline considerably in 2018 to a level of about 9.5%. Most countries maintained a stable exchange rate, but of course, stable exchange rates, interest rates in 2017, despite currency depreciation. But also we have seen improvement in most African countries in 2017 in terms of currency stability. We have seen huge depreciations in 2016 and 2015. But by 2017, most currencies stabilized. Inflation remains high in many countries because of oil prices and devaluation. In terms of trade performance, we have noted improvement in terms of exports due to the recovery in the global economy. We have seen increases in exports and a reduction, slight reduction in imports overall. And we expect the African Continental Free Trade Area to play a critical role in Africa's trade performance moving forward, as the next presentation will highlight. In terms of social development, overall, the continent is continue to make positive progress. Poverty headcount ratio declined. Unfortunately, most of the statistics we have for the continent as a whole is outdated. And this is a challenge that we should all work together in order to address. Right now, we don't know the exact poverty rate in Africa today. The statistics we are using is an outdated one. The latest we have was for 2013. And I think this is an embarrassment for us to say, to use these figures. But we believe that when we go country by country, we see a decline in poverty rate in many African countries. However, inequality remains a challenge, and Africa is the second highest unequal continent in terms of Gini coefficient of about 0.44, which is very high, and 7 of the 10 most unequal countries in the world are in Africa. This is a challenge that we need to address collectively, because high inequality is a threat to political and economic stability on the continent. In terms of access to services, education, health, there is also notable improvement across countries, and the overview of economic and social conditions, which is before you, shows improvements across the continents in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of access to clean water, and so on and so on. But we still observe alarming inequalities in terms of access to social services, with respect to women and with respect to rural areas. And Africa has the biggest divide between urban and rural areas in the world. Again, this is another threat. Although we have to note that this divide is narrowing, has been narrowing over the last few years, but still it remains very high and it needs to be addressed. We have seen increases in public expenditure across Africa relative to GDP, and today public expenditure as a ratio of GDP in Africa compares to the ratio in OECD's countries. But the outcomes of these increases in public expenditure are relatively limited. So there is a question about the quality of public expenditure and public sector management. So more needs to be done in order to reallocate resources, public resources, to promote growth and to promote social development. So obviously, we have seen in many countries spending on education, spending on health has been low, although overall public spending increased. Looking at medium-term prospects, again, the medium-term prospects for Africa are positive. We expect Africa to grow by about 3.6% in 2018 and 3.8% in 2019. Again, the same factors that contributed to Africa's growth over the last few years are likely to be sustained in terms of improved macroeconomic environment, in terms of improvement also in political conditions, and in terms of also the recovery. We have seen a slight recovery in productivity, which is something positive. However, productivity in Africa still remains the lowest among all regions, and more needs to be done to increase productivity and to increase diversification away from primary commodities in order to accelerate growth and sustain growth, create jobs. The threats to Africa's growth moving forward also remain more or less the same. The positive trends are likely to continue in terms of political stability and in terms of continued commitment to investment in infrastructure, that is likely to foster private investment and so on. But the threats of weather conditions, climate change, and the threats of political instability in some parts of the continent also likely to continue. Also, Africa is highly integrated in the world economy. And we have been seeing this because some analysts argue that Africa is not that integrated in the world economy because we contribute very little to global trade, about 2.2%. We contribute very little to global growth, less than 3%. But while our contribution is small, we are still highly integrated in the world economy in terms of direction of trade, exports and imports. And changes in the global economy always have effects. They can have significant effects on growth and development on the continents. And I think the next presentation will look at it. This is an issue that we need to address by trading more among ourselves within the continent. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Erika. Merci beaucoup pour votre belle présentation. Je pense que ça a été clair. L'Afrique est sur une bonne voie en matière de macroéconomie, croissance surtout en 2017, mais des inégalités toujours, des dépenses publiques qui augmentent sans pour autant que...
It's important that inequalities be addressed. There are many things that we can say, but while waiting for discussions, I would like to invite Mr. Stefan Karingi to come and give us an overview of regional integration in Africa, progress on regional integration in Africa. Mr. Stephen Karingi, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Take you through in your document package. It's document ECA, Committee of Experts, number 37/3, which is the assessment of progress on regional integration in Africa. So the document is in 5 parts. So the document is in 5 parts. It starts by providing you an overview on the progress that the African continent has made in terms of integration. In the presentation, we indicate and remind you that regional integration has actually been a long-standing priority for our continent, and we highlight some of the initiatives that you have undertaken as member states, including Agenda 2063, which we are implementing now, the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. We highlight the Continental Free Trade Area, which forms the basis of our discussions here. It also highlights some of the initiatives at the sub-regional level that are undertaken by the regional economic communities. And we highlight that we see that at the global level, there is a rising trend towards protectionism, which in itself forms a challenge or becomes a challenge for Africa's agenda for structural transformation. And so we indicate that regional integration is actually a very good response, or deepening and accelerating regional integration is a very good response for the African continent to what we see as rising protectionism. Now, The report also highlights the progress that has been made in the various areas of regional integration. And this varies. We see that for 3 of the regional economic communities, they already have free trade areas that are operational. We also have regional economic communities that already have a customs union. And within some of the regional economic communities, we do have subsets of their member states who already have economic and monetary unions, that is UEMOA and CEMAC. Now, even within the RECs, as you will see in the report, the levels of integration within the RECs varies, and what you see in the report is coming from the African Regional Integration Index, in which we provide you the placement of each African country within the different RECs for which they are members and how they are doing in the different dimensions of regional integration. Now, in terms of intra-African trade, I think we are going to revisit this again, but there has been an increase from the last time, from 2000, when we were operating at 9%. By 2016, we had reached 18%. And EAC and SADC are the best performing regional economic communities. Now, the report then goes on to give you progress on what is happening in some of the specific areas, starting with the issue of industrial development and the nexus with infrastructure. And we highlight that industrial development, which is crucial to us being able to produce what we want to trade, is actually being hampered by infrastructure gaps. We highlight or we remind you in that report that we still continue to need substantial amount of resources for the implementation of the projects identified as the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. And we indicate that the private sector is not playing as much role as it should when it comes to providing the infrastructure development commitments, which are estimated at about 75 billion per year for the period 2012-2016, yet the private sector was only contributing 10%. So as Ministers of Finance, this is something to look at. Now, we also highlight some of the infrastructure services where progress has been made recently. We talk about the launch of the Single African Air Transport Market in January 2018, and we believe that this is going to contribute to the growth of the Africa aviation. The report then indicates that for the non-trade part of our regional integration, we have limitations. Just to give you an example, in the area of intra-African investments, we find that we do have bilateral investment treaties between African countries. The question of whether this is a good thing or a bad thing is something that we can debate. Majority of them have not entered into force. However, we have a Pan-African Investment Code, which you have been discussing as member state, which could help rationalize the investment regime. This is an area that we believe, if it is tackled, non-trade integration would make progress. In terms of productive integration, it continues to be limited because of our reliance on primary commodities. And the report highlights that the underutilization of the potential of regional value chains is one explanation why productive integration continue to remain very low. Yet it is possible for us to have regional value chains of cotton to textile, cocoa to chocolate, coffee to its byproducts. Another area of non-trade integration that we highlight is in terms of the movement of people. Only 10 African countries, by the time we did the report, offered liberal access to other Africans. Now, the good thing is in Kigali, when the leaders were signing the African Continental Free Trade Area, did also, a good number of them, 30 of them did also sign the protocol on the free movement of persons. And we believe when you combine this with the Single African Air Transport Market, we are going to witness progress in the non-trade integration. Then the report gives you early introduction to the debate on the African Continental Free Trade Area. We see this as a milestone in terms of showing progress in regional integration. We need 22 ratifications. 2 have been deposited. There too, we are expected to be deposited soon. Outstanding issues in the CFTA, as highlighted in the report, include annexes to the adopted protocols and the schedules, and I think the ES in her statement did indicate what we expect between now, Nouakchott, and Addis Ababa next year. For your information, the second phase will focus on investment, competition, and intellectual property rights, and your secretariat is actually proposing that e-commerce be considered as a possible additional topic in the phase 2 of the negotiations. Without taking too much time, because we'll have a specific presentation on the theme of the conference, just to highlight that the report you have does indicate what it would take for AfCFTA to lead to inclusive development. We believe that all African countries will gain in the long term from the CFTA, but because of the diversity that we have as a continent, there will be differentiated results once we start implementing the CFTA, but we do give ideas on how to ensure that all of us benefit so that you do not have this huge differentiation between and within countries. Which takes me to the other point of towards an effective AfCFTA. The first issue being on how to deal with the short-term costs that countries may experience, and I think we are going to revisit this issue. The numbers that were given by the Executive Secretary is that we do not expect the impact because of the loss of tariff revenues to be something to worry too much about, because we believe that even if it's a short-term pain, the long-term gains of the expanded tax base is going to be so huge or significant to deal with those issues. She highlighted how we can deal with that through the exclusion list, and also the necessity for us as Ministers of Finance and Planning to invest more in the boosting intra-African trade, which gives you ideas of the areas that you need to develop to benefit from the CFTA. In conclusion, we do make a few recommendations, which basically revisit the idea that we do not only need to sign, we need to ratify and implement, and the ECA and the AUC will continue to support this process. We need to consider the possibility of enhancing investment regulations and policies so that you can actually have to boost intra-African investment beyond the boosting intra-African trade. We need to ensure that we follow closely the impacts so that we can take appropriate measures, and we believe to optimize on the AfCFTA. The boosting of intra-African trade action plan implementation is very, very critical in the area of infrastructure gaps and other areas. So with that, experts, I submit the report on the progress on regional integration. Thank you very much, Chair.
D'accord, merci beaucoup, Karigui. Merci d'abord pour avoir respecté le temps de parole, mais aussi pour cet exposé clair et instructif sur l'intégration régionale en Afrique. À présent, je voudrais, mesdames et messieurs, ouvrir la discussion générale. Et
now to open the general discussion, and I'll give the floor to whoever asks for it. This allow us to improve on the reports. So we'll begin by opening a list of speakers. Raise your hand if you want to speak, please. Just raise your nameplate if you want to speak. We'll discuss the two themes simultaneously. Looks like people are tired or hungry, perhaps. Which is which? Perhaps because we started late. Kenya has asked for the floor to be the first one on the floor. Anyone else? Then Morocco. So for the time being, we have Kenya and Morocco. Kenya, you can take off.
Thank you, Chair, and let me take this opportunity to congratulate you on your election and also the way you are conducting the meeting, although you are temporarily there. But Chair, and let me thank the presenters for the good information given to us on integration and also on the development in Africa. Now, one thing that, or three things that are going to be very important for the successful implementation of the CFTA are the following: transformation, diversification, and value addition. The first presenter talked of improved trade performance, but I don't know whether the detailed report has the information on who trades with who and what do they trade. That is a question. Now, the other proposal that I would want to make is that these reports are very important and they are annual events. And we are starting the AfCFTA as a new important project that will take Africa very far. So I would like to propose that these reports, in the next time they are produced, they give us some information on the development baseline and perhaps more information on the progress made in this line. Now, and specifically covering the three areas that I mentioned, that is the extent of transformation, diversification, and value addition, if they can be measured. Finally, Chair, I think it has become a lamentation about lack of statistics or availability of only outdated statistics. May I therefore know what steps UNCA is taking to address this issue? It is one thing which keeps on appearing every time there is an expert or any other conference on a topical issue in the continent. Thank you, Chair.
Merci, merci, Monsieur le délégué du Kenya. Maroc.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Tout d'abord, je tiens à remercier la CEA en particulier, mais ainsi que l'Union africaine.
Thank the ACA, the AU, and the African Development Bank for the very rich documents that have been put at our disposal. I have some questions regarding the first report on the economic and social report. We welcome the increased growth, the accelerated growth in Africa to 2.3 in 2017. We remain below the level of growth that Africa was able to record just some years ago, but also in relation to the level of development that would be necessary to reduce unemployment and ensure sustained economic development of our continent. Regarding regional integration, as was said in the presentation, we've seen that the level of integration, intra-African integration, although it is moving forward, progressing, but we note that regarding exports, there's a level of integration which is increasing gradually as opposed to the level of imports, which is actually regressing somewhat. So without putting into question the trends indicated in the analysis in the document, we note that there are significant gaps in the statistics intra-African trade. If you make a comparison between the sources mentioned in the ECA report and the UNCTAD sources, we have other statistics that are different if you look at the Comtrade. And there are other sources such as the IMF who also provide other figures. And there are differences there between these figures, and for some of them there are significant differences. I think it will be necessary for the ECA to look a bit into this sources of data, in as much as our ambition is to arrive rapidly at appropriate data for facilitating the implementation of the continental integration and CFTA. The other remark is true that regarding the CFTA, there's significant progress that has been realized through the agreement signed by the 44 countries, and we obviously welcome the 2 countries that have already ratified the agreement, but the road remains long. The road that we need to travel is still long. As indicated in the assessment report, there are difficulties on the ground. Thank you very much. Distinguished delegate from Morocco, we now give the floor to the presenter to answer those 2 questions and comments. The first one from Kenya regarding the significance of the transformation and also the role of value addition in the integration process, and also a recommendation that goes in the direction of giving more information on trade and indicating also the products involved. I think any one of the speakers could give an answer. The Morocco also did speak about trade statistics that show some differences, and also refer to the rate of growth, which is not yet at the level that will allow us to make progress on the various aspects. Speakers, you have the floor now to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the comments and questions. On the increases in trade, actually, the increase was mainly due to increased prices of some commodities, especially oil. Merchandise trade increased by merchandise exports increased by 8.9
Africa Regional Integration Index. So we are in the process of getting a second edition of the Africa Regional Integration Index, so at least we'll be able to provide also a baseline of what is happening to our integration once we publish that this year. And secondly, we are in the process of developing what we are calling a private sector forecast African Continental Free Trade Area Business Index, which we will use to monitor what the CFTA is doing in terms of taking forward our private sector as the main drivers and actors of the CFTA. Thank you.
If there are no other requests for the floor, I would like to give the floor to Mauritania. Discussions have become very interesting, and we have some Mauritania for this round of questions, Guinea as well. We will open the round of questions and then close it once and for all. So we have Mauritania and Guinea. Is there any other country that wishes to take the floor? Mauritania, you have the floor. Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank the presenters for the very clear presentations that were very rich in information. I have two comments, perhaps two questions, or perhaps one question and then a comment. The first comment is in regards to aspects to do with investment and industrialization, aspects that don't seem to have been deeply elaborated in the two reports. When I look at the first report, that is the report on the evaluation of the current socioeconomic status in Africa, it was mentioned that investment was one of the drivers of growth in 2007. There was a growth in investment, and it stopped there. Perhaps we should have gone a bit deeper on that particular aspect and give more details on the allocation of that investment, what was from the public sector, what was from the private sector, but also how was that investment spread out according to the various regions, and how does that relate to the growth that we saw in those regions in 2007. In regards to industrialization, I believe that that aspect, as well as investment, are very important aspects for growth and employment. And as we know, we have economies that are economies that export raw products, and there is a lot that we lose in terms of growth and resource mobilization. So if we could strengthen further the industrialization process, we could create more jobs, gain more, and we would be able to strengthen our poverty eradication measures. So I feel that those aspects were not really elaborated on in the reports. Now, on the second comment, it's on the report which dealt on the socioeconomic situation on the page 3, 16 point B, fiscal deficit. It's mentioned that that deficit dropped to 5.2 in 2017. However, in the graph that we have on the other side of the page, that is on 16, it says that in the number for 2016, the number was higher. So it means that the drop was more significant than is mentioned on the previous page, unless if I'm mistaken. In terms of the question, it's mentioned that where we are, given the current growth rate that we have now. Thank you very much. The delegation feels that the report should take into account the level of corruption on the continent, which is also a factor that has an impact on economic and social activities within the continent. Because within the report, there is mention of fiscal deficit, and we feel that corruption has an impact on growth and on the economic situation within the continent, and also on the quality of public expenditure, which could also have an impact on fiscal deficits. Thank you very much. Thank you, Guinea, for that question, which was very clear, and thank you to the Mauritania delegate for the two comments and a question that you asked. I would like to give the floor to the presenters.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks to respected delegates for the question and the comment. On the first question by the delegate from Mauritania on investment and industrialization. Yes, investment in Africa has been one of the main drivers of the growth we have seen. We have seen almost in all countries sustained increases in public investment on infrastructure in particular. And this has been one of the main drivers of growth on the continent. The overview is very brief. It does not provide a breakdown of changes in investment, but public investment has been the main driver. Among other expenditure items, private consumption is also an important driver of growth on the continent. We have seen continued increases in private consumption on the continent, but also private investment has been increasing in many countries, but remains very small compared to public investment. On the question of industrialization, for so many years, ECA presented reports on the imperative of industrialization in Africa, and I don't want to repeat what we have discussed before, but I would like to refer the respectable delegate to the ECA website and publication on this imperative of industrialization. If we do not add value to the primary commodities we produce, then we will continue to export primary commodities at low prices and continue to face the challenges of growth volatility and limited job creation on the continent. So this is an important observation which we share, and we will continue to press on all Africans to continue to work on how to add value to Africa's commodities and industrialize in different areas. The question of corruption by the honorable delegate from Guinea, this is an important issue for Africa as a whole. We have dedicated a number of reports, African Governance Report African Governance Report 4, which we launched about a year ago, just over a year ago, was dedicated to the issue of corruption in Africa. Sources of corruption, measurement of corruption, and the international dimension of corruption, and the institutions needed in order to fight corruption. And we will be launching another edition of African Governance Report. This is African Governance Report 5, which focuses on management of natural resources for increased mobilization of the day after tomorrow, starting at 9 o'clock, and there is an extensive discussion on issues of corruption and institutions in the context of natural resource management and domestic revenue mobilization. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, M. Elireka. M. Karingi.
Monsieur le Président, je n'ai pas à commenter à cette table.
Merci beaucoup. Merci pour avoir apporté.
Much. Thank you for clarifying and responding to the questions raised by the delegates from the various countries. I would like now to propose that we take a break of 1 hour. 1 hour because we've had a significant delay, and we would like to allow everyone to be able to relax a bit and to rest a bit, and we will meet here at 4:20, 20 minutes past 4, to tackle the second part, which will be dedicated to the presentation on the African Continental Free Trade Area. If there are no other observations, we would like to adjourn now. Thank you very much.
delegates. If we can call the House to order. The second session of the expert segment will begin shortly. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. We are going to resume this session. I think that you have rested well enough. And obviously we are short of time and we want to continue. It was said in the agenda, it was mentioned in the agenda that we need to move to the second batch of presentations on the theme of the 51st session of the Conference of African Ministers of Finance, Planning and Economic Development of the African Continental Free Trade Area, creating fiscal space for jobs and economic diversification. This presentation will be made by Mr. Stefan. There was a second session. Rather, it's going to be followed by a general discussion, and then we shall move to the next session, which is going to last probably for some time. The presentation of the theme will be on 51st session. Will follow after the first one. Now, we suggest that the third session, statutory issues, which had to take place from 15:30 to 16:30 for 1 hour, as well as the fourth session, which were to last over 1 hour. We want to postpone these sessions to tomorrow. So today, we are going to stop with respect to the agenda which you have before you. We are going to do the second session on the follow-up of the presentation of the theme of the 51st session. So that's the adjustment which we suggest. If there's no amendment, we can just continue with our deliberations. I'd like to inform you too that the break has been good for us because we have had confirmation from the Southern African region that Lesotho has finally been appointed. So for your information, we have Lesotho with us, and we shall have Senegal from West Africa. We have Kenya in Eastern Africa, and Chad in Central Africa. So those are the 4 countries that we have for per region. We just have to have Northern Africa so that the full bureau is complete. We hope that in the next few hours we shall know the results of the consultation of Northern Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, right now I'd like to wish you a good resumption of our deliberations this afternoon. In the morning, there was not much that we did, but the morning was long. And people were patient. You were patient. You listened to the 2 presentations that we closely followed. And I'd like to give the floor now to Mr. Stephen, who is already here, who is going to present the document. Mr. Chairman, your attention, please. Chad, sorry for the interruption, Mr. Chairman. I had raised my flag a few moments ago, but you didn't notice me. I'd like to bring clarification on the list of the members of the Bureau that you have mentioned. Concerning Chad, I think that for the time being, Central African region is consulting. The states of Central Africa wanted that Chad continues to be representative of the Bureau. However, that decision was taken by our colleagues from Central African region without being informed, without informing us, without us being associated with that decision. The Chad diplomacy which I represent here, I would like to clarify that we are still waiting for the direction of our capital so that we could accept that offer from our colleagues. For a time being, in Central African region, I would like to tell you that just remove the name of Chad as we wait to receive our consultations from our capital. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that clarification. We had understood that the choice of Chad was not final, and that these were provisions that were put in place temporarily. So your proposal confirms that we are still waiting for your consultations with your capital to be able to ascertain that choice. For the time being, Central Africa doesn't have any representative as such. And as vice, of course, we do not have any representative for the Central African region. That's the message that I wanted to give you. Yes, we have understood. So the Central African region, as well as the Northern African region, are still waiting for their choices. However, the other regions already have their representatives, where we have Lesotho, Kenya, as well as Senegal. I'm being told that it's actually Ethiopia, not Kenya. In the morning, it was mentioned that it was Kenya, but right now, I'm being told and corrected that it is Ethiopia. We are still waiting for the Northern African region. Probably we shall receive their choice. So let's say that Central Africa is still consulting, as well as Northern Africa. They are still consulting. Southern Africa appointed Lesotho. Eastern Africa is Ethiopia, and Western Africa has appointed Senegal. So we can go with that, meanwhile. Do you want to say something? Thank you. Now let's move to the presentation by Stephen Carey, who is going to make a presentation on the African Continental Free Trade Area, creating fiscal space for jobs and economic diversification.
Yeah. So the document that informs our deliberations this afternoon is the document ECA/COE/37/13, which is African Continental Free Trade Area, creating fiscal space for jobs and economic diversification. So we've already started this discussion. And so what I would want to do now is just to provide highlights of the content in the paper. I do encourage you to read the 4 key messages, but let's go straight to why we think that actually the case for the CFTA, it's no longer being made, because we've already made the case for the CFTA, and our leaders have already signed, and countries have started ratifying. So I think what we want to discuss here now is how do we take forward the implementation and make sure that we benefit not only our private sector, but also our people, but we do it in a way that is fiscally sustainable, or at least in a way that it expands our fiscal space. So we have before you there a comparison of what is happening in terms of the economic structure of Africa with one of our major comparator, and that is India. And I think you may have heard this before. The size, size in terms of the landmass may be bigger, but in terms of the population, almost the same. In terms of the GDP, almost the same. In terms of our tax effort, almost the same. Now, the only difference is that if you are an investor in India, or if you are a producer in India, you have one market to deal with, and so you can be able to enjoy the scale. But if you're an African business, you have about 54 borders that you have to deal with if you want to operate as a business. In fact, you do face a tariff, an average tariff of 6.9%, not even I believe that the opportunities are there now to be harnessed through the implementation of the CFTA, because it creates one African market. It also gives us not just economies of scale, but the CFTA is not just about trading goods. It's also about the trading services. And in this